Well, welcome everyone to Hostos Community College. My name is Diana Kramer. I serve as the Assistant to the President and Director of the President's Office, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to the culminating and closing event of this year's 12th Annual CTL Professional Development Day, also known as SPA Day. And we are here today to discuss a very timely and important topic where we will be speaking up for AAPI. And this roundtable today will be addressing violence against Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, placing it within the broader sphere of violence against communities of color, and discussing the history of and opportunities for allyship. I will be serving as your moderator today for the discussion and ask you all to keep in mind CTL's SPA Day theme for the day, which is imagining a brighter future through rediscovering, teaching, and learning. Hopefully today from this roundtable, we can all rediscover a little bit of teaching and learning about the communities we will be discussing. Welcome to all of our panelists. I will introduce you briefly. Please be reminded to mute yourselves when you are not speaking. Before we begin, please allow me to share a brief planned program of the day, of this afternoon rather, with you. I will introduce our panelists and guests. We will then go through 2 rounds of questions where we will ask each panelist to answer. We will then have some questions and answers that we take from the audience, and then we will permit all our panelists to make a closing statement. With that, and before we formally begin, I'd like everyone to join us in a moment of silence for our dearly departed director of the Hostos Academic Learning Center, Professor Isabelli. For those of you who do not know, today's SPA Day activities hosted by the Center for Teaching and Learning are dedicated to her memory, for she was a staunch advocate for education to all of our students. And with that, we ask everyone to please bow their heads for a minute and pray in whatever form you feel comfortable. May she rest in peace. On behalf of the Office of the President, we thank our colleagues, particularly the chair of the College-wide Senate, for partnering with us to offer this event today. We also recognize our colleagues in CTL for permitting us to share their event space and programming to discuss this topic. I recently read an article that captured the essence of today's climate for Asians, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders. And it stated that these communities are presently battling 2 viruses, coronavirus and hate. As we begin today's roundtable, we ask everyone to be open to the information and stories that will be shared in the hopes of creating an even more welcoming and inclusive community at our dear college. With that, I would like to introduce our interim president, Dr. Daisy Coco de Filippis, for her remarks.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Recent events have demonstrated an increasing amount of bias, hatred, and violence directed at Asian Americans. What prompts such loathsome, illegal, and democratic behavior? How can we change it? How can we play a part in ending the sad and disturbing history of anti-immigrant feeling in this country? We can start by understanding and examining it, and by making our sympathies and empathy known. We must always and ever offer our support, our strength, and our love to those who are made to suffer unjustly. I would like to thank our distinguished guests from the political and the academic worlds for joining us today. I look forward to listening and learning from you all. There's much work to do and many things to change, and no better time to start than now. Gracias.
Thank you so much, President. We now welcome our chair of the College-wide Senate, as well as a chair of our Behavioral and Social Sciences Unit, Dr. Ernest Ialongo.
Thank you, Diana. I want to first off starting by thanking the President's Office, especially Diana Kramer, for helping put this event together, which began as a suggestion from the President a month ago. And a lot's been done in that time. I also really want to thank Carlos Guevara and Cynthia Jones of CTL for agreeing to host us this event as part of SPA Day. They were very generous with their time. In addition to being the co-organizer for this event, I am here representing the 2 institutions that I currently lead at the college. As chair of the Behavioral and Social Sciences Department, I want to first recognize the faculty members from the department that are here on the panel: Professor Chris Burrell, and Helen Chang to thank them for their efforts now and always. I also want to give a shout out to Professor Sarah Hoyland and Hector Soto from the department for their invaluable advice as we thought about moving this project forward. My primary role here today is to represent the Hostos College-wide Senate and to show our full support for the AAPI community and denunciation of violence against this community. Additionally, as I noted in my comments to the College-wide Senate back in March, as I noted in my comments to the Senate back in March, just after the wave of shootings of Asian women in Georgia, this violence against the AAPI community is symbolic of the violence against communities of color that has defined our nation's history. And most recently, as Jorge Ramos of Univision noted in the New York Times, quote, "The assaults and insults against the Asian American community bear a striking resemblance to the plight that Latinos and Black and Indigenous people have endured for centuries in the United States. A common racist attack against the Latino community and now increasingly Asian Americans is the demand, go back to your own country, a difficult demand for the millions of us who are American citizens." The goal of our college-wide Senate, as our college, and just as this nation should be, is to be fully inclusive, where everyone finds a home. We hope today's event is part of the process of building a stronger local and national community and of speaking up for the AAPI community that has seen such a staggering increase in incidents of violence in this past year. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Ialongo. I now have the honor of introducing you all to our esteemed panelists for this afternoon. So if you can all just wave when I introduce you. First, I'd like to greet Congresswoman Grace Meng of New York's 6th Congressional District. Welcome, Congresswoman. Senator John Liu of the 11th State Senate District, Senator and Professor, welcome. CUNY's Asian American and Asian Research Institute Executive Director Joyce Moy. Welcome, Director Moy. For those of you that do not know, the Institute is a university-wide scholarly research and resource center that focuses on policies and issues that affect Asians and Asian Americans. And they do host some really incredible events throughout the year. We are also joined by our colleague from a sister institution, Professor Grace Pai. Welcome, Professor. She serves as the Assistant Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Gutman Community College, one of the newest institutions to join CUNY. We also are here joined by our Hostos faculty members from the Behavioral and Social Sciences Department. We have Hostos Associate Professor of History, Chris Burrell. Welcome, Professor Burrell. We also have the Assistant Professor of Political Science from Helen Chang, also from the Behavioral and Social Sciences Unit. And joining us from the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Unit, we have Assistant Professor of Cultural and Medical Anthropology, Victor Torres Velez. Welcome, Professor. And last but certainly not least, we are also joined by one of our very own students who we look forward to hearing your voice in this panel, Ms. Sadia Zaman. Welcome. We now would like to begin with our first round of questions for our panel, and we'd like to begin with you, Congresswoman Meng. Can you please tell us what types of anti-Asian crimes you've seen in your communities in the recent months?
Well, first of all, thank you, Diana, and thank you, Madam President, for inviting me today. And thank you so much for providing this wonderfully encouraging and constructive space for all of us to talk about this important issue. I come to you all the way from Queens, and on behalf of my constituents, thank you so much for grooming our next generation of amazing leaders through the world of CUNY. It's always good to be with my colleague and our political trailblazer, Senator John Liu, and to all the wonderful faculty and students on. Thank you so much. Good to see you again too, Joyce. It's been a really tough year, like you mentioned. We've been just combating, these two different viruses, and quite honestly, we pushed back against uses of the words and phrases like Chinese virus and Kung flu because we all knew we would get to this day, right? Like the events that we've seen in the last few months, especially, aren't necessarily a shock to us. And we've been watching this happen all throughout the country, from verbal to physical attacks, everywhere. I think in the last few months, we've just seen, increased attacks on our most vulnerable, on our elderly. Just in my district alone, and probably overlaps with Senator Liu's district, we've had cases, at a local bakery where a woman was shoved. A 13-year-old boy just playing basketball was called racial slurs. And actually another similar case with a 15-year-old boy in the other part of my district. A mom pushing her baby in a stroller was spat at. So, these are just a few cases in our corner of Northeast Queens where we've seen this happen. And then, of course, you saw the worst case scenario from the murders in Atlanta, Georgia, where 8 people, including 6 Asian American women, were shot and killed. So these are just, unfortunately, a small snapshot of the types of hate incidents that have happened across the country.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Senator Liu, we'd now like you to tell us a little bit about how you and members of your community have responded to some of these incidents mentioned by the Congresswoman.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to join all the panelists here and thank Hostos Community College and President DeFilippis for putting this event together. It is APA, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. By the way, people call Asian Americans all different things. We get called APAs, which is short for Asian Pacific American. Sometimes people use AAPI, which is short for Asian American Pacific Islander. Each has their own nuance, but I think it's fine to use any of these terms. I usually just shorten it to Asian Americans. And the attacks and the bias incidents that Congressmember Meng talked about are particularly hurtful because both she and I always say this, she's a lot younger than I am, but we both have had a lifetime of experiences growing up in Northeast Queens and attending public schools. It's the kind of bias incidents that we've seen are not new to us. And now, honestly, I thought that much of it was deep in my past, but this past year and a half now, we've really seen, I wouldn't even describe it as an increase. It's been an absolute onslaught of anti-Asian hate, racism, bigotry, and bias. And so how do we deal with this? Well, number one, we talk about it. There are things that I talk about, some of my experiences that I actually never talk about. But in trying to encourage people to talk about what's happening, I feel like I have to share my experiences, even though it's, sometimes you feel like if people are going to believe you or if it's necessary to bring it up. And I think it's necessary. So to have an open dialogue and not sweep anything under the rug or not minimize things or not even think that your own experiences don't actually matter or have some kind of importance. That's really like the first step. And this kind of discussion here with the students and the community at Hostos, it's important. And number two, we have legislation that has been passed by Congressmember Meng at the highest level of government, just signed by President Biden last week. That really it's the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. It's something that's necessary to change the tenor of law enforcement and really of community sentiment in this country. She and I also both have in our respective levels of government proposed mandates for Asian American history in our public school curriculums, because I firmly believe that the hate that we have seen is born out of ignorance and fear from this coronavirus and ignorance, because it's easy to blame a community that you don't know a whole lot about. And so we need to increase awareness and education of what the Asian American experience and identity is and what the history has been, so that we don't keep perpetuating these myths that Asian Americans suffer from. Professor Moy knows a lot about this. We get everything from the model minority myth to the perpetual foreigner syndrome and everything in between. And people have to understand this. Even the Asian Americans need to understand what some of this is. And then beyond governmental functions, I think community actions have been invaluable. I can't begin to talk about how many rallies and protests in support of the Asian American community that I've attended that have been organized by people who happen not to be Asian American and primarily attended by people who happen not to be Asian American. I think it's just been a tremendous show of solidarity, very much like what we saw last June in the Black Lives Matter movement and protests that took place all over the country. So it's a combination of individual actions, community actions, and governmental actions that we need to stop this onslaught of anti-Asian hate.
Thank you, Senator, and kudos to you and Congresswoman Mang for passing the hate crimes bill. I think that will really advance a lot of the conversation around this topic. And to quote what you had mentioned, there has been a recent onslaught. And with that, I'd like to ask Executive Director Moy that some think that these recent hate attacks on Asians and Asian Americans in the US are a relatively new phenomenon. But we have heard from the Asian American community that this is not so. Can you tell us a little bit about the history?
Yes, well, first, thank you so much to Hostos Community College for hosting this. I cannot thank your president enough for the strong statement that she put out against anti-Asian hate. I've had the pleasure of going to Hostos on a number of events, and I must say it is one of the most welcoming campuses I've ever been on, everyone from faculty to staff to students. So again, thank you. But, in terms of the history of violence and scapegoating of Asian Americans, it is a long history. I can tell you that my family is in the United States 6 generations. And I say it that way because my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father were not permitted to become naturalized citizens in the United States because of their Chinese heritage. They were born in China. I am a US citizen by virtue of birthright. And that also was established by a case that the Chinese community fought all the way to the Supreme Court to establish. So let me just start with something which many of you may have heard of, and that is the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, barring any Chinese from migrating to the United States. This was largely due to the fact that there was a great economic depression that took place in 1873 due to the failure of leadership in this country. And as a result of that, the Asians, the Chinese in particular, were scapegoated. We were blamed for low wages, the lack of jobs, and so on. And if you understood the history and you knew how many Chinese there were in this country, it was mathematically impossible for us to have had that kind of power. There was 0.002% in this country. But we were a convenient scapegoat, as Senator Lee mentioned. When people don't know anything about you, when your cultural behaviors are different, and so on, you're easily scapegoated. But this Exclusion Act was not overturned until 1943, when the Chinese were allies with the United States against Japan in World War II. And even then, they kept in place a quota which only allowed 105 Chinese to immigrate to the United States each year. I remember as a kid growing up in the United States, never seeing another Chinese person for miles and months unless I went to Chinatown. And we were highly segregated as a result of the fact that this was not a country or a community that accepted us. This had major implications on the civic engagement of the Chinese community in particular for years. When I was growing up, I said to my father, one day I'd like to become senator. My father and his friend were rolling on the floor in laughter. Have you looked at yourself, Joyce? You're Chinese. Just remember that. That was the kind of response I got. But there were a number of other incidents that I think, when we fast forward to the death or the murder of Vincent Chin, this again was a result of economic upheaval. The Japanese had become extremely competitive against the US auto industry. And in fact, many of their vehicles were preferred over American vehicles. And again, this is a failure of American business leadership to create the kinds of products that were competitive. And so two auto workers, believing that Vincent Chin, who was a 27-year-old Chinese American, out celebrating his upcoming wedding, was Japanese, and they attacked him. They killed him. These two men got off with a fine of $3,000 and 0 days in jail. Again, the Asians were scapegoated because we were losing jobs in the United States. And today we fast forward again, because of the failure of leadership. We have a situation where over 500,000 people have died in this country. And yes, again, it's easy to say it is because of the coronavirus and it is the Chinese virus. And yes, there may be things that have been done wrong, but think about the years and the centuries of epidemics that have happened. Never have we blamed the people the way that we are currently doing that kind of assignment of blame. And we have a situation where there is a demonization of China. We're not talking about Russia. That's something that jumps out loud and clear to me. But again, the history of violence is something that I know of from a personal level, the things I heard about from my grandfather and my father, and I myself have experienced. To tell me to go back to China after we've been here for 4 generations is absolutely incredible. My daughters and my grandchildren are 5th and 6th generation Chinese Americans.
Thank you for sharing your story with us, Executive Director Moy. And I'm sure there are many more stories you can share with us from such a lifetime and legacy of a family in the United States. So thank you for telling us. Based on what has been just shared by Executive Director Moy, we have learned that there is a long and lengthy history that has been built upon, and we're curious how to now begin building the bridge. So Professor Pai, can you tell us a little bit about what role can colleges institutionally can play in supporting students to build solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
Absolutely. Thank you, Diana. First, good afternoon, everyone. I do want to take a moment to thank you, Diana. Thank you, President De Filippis, who I guess is on a phone call now, and thank you to my CUNY colleagues at Hostos. I also wanted to take a moment just to say a few words of acknowledgement. I have to admit, I was a little hesitant to join this panel at first because I was just so starstruck by this lineup of Asian American giants. Congresswoman Meng, just thank you for all that you do in serving our country. I still often think about like your experience at the Capitol on that infamous day of insurrection. So thank you for all that you do, including introducing the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. Senator Liu, I think the Gothamists, put it best in the headline a couple of days ago. New York's Asian American political trailblazer. Just all that you've done from being the first Asian American elected to citywide office, city council member, controller, the current senator. You've done so much for not just Asian Americans within New York, but just New York at large. And then Director Moy, I've long admired your leadership at RE. And I also attended just, I guess a month or two ago, the CUNY Faculty Diversity and Inclusion Conference. And I want to congratulate you on the UACD Diversity Award. It was very well deserved. So again, I'm incredibly honored to be here today. And thank you again, Ernest, for talking me into this. So back to the question, what role can colleges institutionally play in supporting students to build BIPOC solidarity? So I think we have to begin with recognizing all student groups, right? It's absolutely critical to respond to major events like George Floyd's murder. And I do want to also take a moment to remember that, to honor him. But to respond to major events like his murder or the Atlanta shootings through symbolic acts, right? So actions like moments of silence, like we did at the beginning of this event, even today, as well as institutional statements, all those actions matter, right? And even if some might criticize those as being performative in nature, they do matter. But every institution must also ensure that there's equity in the responses so that all students of color feel included, feel seen, and feel heard, right? So for example, I'd say that it would be inequitable to respond to the death of George Floyd and the subsequent BLM movement with strong institutional statements, but then not do the same after the Atlanta shootings and anti-Asian hate crimes. And in fact, that's what I wrote my recent op-ed piece about that was published in Inside Higher Ed. I was curious after the Atlanta shootings about institutional responses in general across higher ed. So I ended up doing just an ad hoc social media analysis where in part, I compared CUNY responses to George Floyd's murder, as well as to what happened after the Atlanta shootings. And I found that 15 out of the 18 or 83% of the CUNY 2-year and 4-year colleges posted on Instagram after George Floyd versus only 67%, right? 12 out of 18 posted after the Atlanta shootings. So I think it's that type of uneven actions that could add to potential feelings of exclusion or feelings that Asians that were perpetually going to be the invisible minority. I'm also supportive of racial solidarity movements, uniting with the joint goal to dismantle white supremacy, right? But we also have to be realistic at the same time in acknowledging how the history of Black and Asian relations in the US has been fraught, right? There's been a lot of anti-Asian sentiment in Black communities and vice versa, a lot of anti-Black sentiment in Asian communities. I also did write an op-ed piece about that last year. And recently, because many of the perpetrators of violence against Asians have been Black, there is increasing fear and misinformation being spread about Blacks within AAPI communities through channels, especially like WeChat, right? Just to give you a personal anecdote, just a few weeks ago, I was at a Chinese bakery in the Lower East Side, close to my son's elementary school. And then, I was just chatting it up with the store owner, and she immediately jumped to tell me, oh, be careful. So last night, there was just an attack on 2 Asian women at the Popeyes on Delancey Street around the corner. So 小心那些黑鬼 is what she said in Chinese, which 黑鬼, so that's a derogatory term that's often used in Chinese. I'm ashamed to say even my own family members have used that, and it literally translates to like black devil or black ghost, if you will. Right, so it's acts like that worry me because it's emblematic of communities becoming more insular. And I feel like the little progress that we made in building racial solidarity after the death of George Floyd last year is being erased. So now, more than ever, all colleges, we need to be teaching and supporting students on how to address misinformation in their own communities, in their friend networks, and even in their own families. Right? We also need to equip students with the tools, or at least the space, to reflect on how to build also multi-generational solidarity across the BIPOC community, because oftentimes it is the older generations that tend to have more entrenched feelings of division and stereotypes. And a final concrete thing I would say that all colleges can do to build racial solidarity is to invest in bystander training. Right? I think all our students should know the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. So that to me is a form of teaching our students both ethical reasoning as well as civic engagement.
Thank you, Professor Pai. And I'd like to note the recent attacks that you mentioned on Delancey Street outside in the city in positing this question to Professor Chang. Professor, can you tell us what political factors have contributed to the recent spike in crimes and racism against Asian Americans in our community and across the nation?
Sure. I mean, I don't think there's a single political factor explanation, but being an academic, I'll point out the 3 that I think are the most important. I think first is the widespread use of racialized political speech and hate speech by our highest level of elected officials. And this kind of rhetoric and speech has been amplified by social media and also traditional media. Most importantly, it has stuck with Americans on a large scale. So there is emerging research on how quickly this happens online. So a UCSF study looked at a spike in anti-Asian tweets and hashtags that appeared within a week of President Trump's numerous tweets about the Chinese virus. But it's not just online harassment. There are real world consequences, and political scientists have studied this phenomena historically and more recently. So I'm going to highlight 2 Asian scholars. Desmond Ng found that local screenings of Birth of a Nation increase the likelihood of a local KKK chapter. Tianyi Wang's study of exposure to popular anti-Semitic radio show in the interwar period increased the likelihood of pro-Nazi German-American Bund groups. So, I mean, this data and research really asks us to take seriously the power of speech and its impact, and to educate, our students and our community, and really address this. Second, I think it's a lack of representation of Asian Americans in the political sphere. We have two very strong leaders here with us, and we need more. So I think the Asian American umbrella term has both benefits and costs. I think, and we really need a diversity of Asian Americans in our elected representatives. So, just to be that person, the Reflective Democracy campaign, did some calculations that AAPI members made up 0.9% of elected leaders across all levels of government, but make up a little over 6%. The numbers differ depending on how you count and who you count. In terms of Asian American voter engagement, very high in 2020, has not always been consistently high across all levels, local, state, national, and across the US. And so I think this representation and voter engagement issue then leads to a lack of visibility in the political arena, I think, which would really help combat the violence and racism that we're seeing today. And finally, Senator Liu mentioned this model minority myth, and it's also used in the political arena to minimize the hate and violence that Asian Americans are facing. And it also can be used to create divisions between people of color who can be working together, following up with Professor Pai's earlier comments. Pew surveys have found there's a wide partisan gap in views of whether Asian people face a lot of discrimination. And even these numbers are low, 38% of Democrats and 14% of Republicans. And these are voters or party identifiers. So, there's a lot of data to support, these explanations. I believe that Professor Burrell may speak more on this allyship topic, so I'll leave it here at this point and stop.
Thank you, Professor Chang. And shifting to your colleague, Professor Burrell, can you provide a little bit of historical context to Professor Chang's response? Are there any examples of Asian American and Black solidarity we can point to as a reference point for what is possible today in offering support for interracial alliances in the struggles against anti-Asian American racism and white supremacy?
Thank you, Diana. Let me first begin by also just expressing how honored I am to be a part of this panel here today, and thanks to everyone at the college for putting this event together. I think I want to build on both what Professor Pai said as well as what Professor Chang said, in that it is really important for people to know that there is a history of interracial solidarity, right, around activism for civil rights and liberation. You can look to the lives of Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama as examples of this. And I'll say a little bit about Yuri Kochiyama's life as an example. She was Japanese American activist born in California in the early 1920s to a somewhat prominent Japanese American family who was sort of brought up in this sort of ethos of assimilation and into American society. But her father was essentially imprisoned, while in the hospital recovering from surgery during World War II. And it was, her family's experience during World War II, losing her father after weeks of being detained, while trying to recover from surgery, and then having her family experience internment, in an American concentration camp during World War II. That really changed her consciousness, or where she began to develop a more sort of critical consciousness and ways to look at the experience of Asian Americans throughout US history. After the war, she married a US veteran, Bill Kochiyama. They lived in Mississippi for a while and eventually moved to New York. where she worked in a diner that had a predominantly African-American staff. And in getting to know her coworkers, she also began to learn about the discrimination that African-Americans experienced in the United States. And after the family moved to Harlem, she continued to build community with her neighbors. And that really became one of the cornerstones, right, of her life and her life's work, sort of building community with others. She had the opportunity to meet Malcolm X in 1963 during a protest that was taking place at a construction site in Brooklyn, where they were protesting the lack of Black construction workers being hired to work at the site. And pushing her way to the front of the line, she said she wanted to shake, you know, Malcolm X's hand, and she was going to do that no matter what. Being able to engage him in a brief conversation, she actually sort of began to gently challenge some of Malcolm's views about the potential for, you know, interracial alliances. She was eventually invited to join the Organization of Afro-American Unity that he was founding in 1964. And she became a close, a confidant of Malcolm X over the period of that time. And in fact, she was the last person to see and to hold Malcolm X while he was alive when he was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in 1965. And she credited Malcolm X as being, you know, the single person who really affected her consciousness the most. But she was developing a radical critique, you know, of American society, of capitalism, of political organizing. And so she also considered people like Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba and Assata Shakur to be people that she, you know, looked up to and learned a great deal from. But Kochiyama's activism wasn't only defined by her connection to Malcolm X. As Director Moy mentioned, you know, after the murder of Vincent Chin, she helped to establish a group called Asian Americans for Action, and was involved in a broad array of Asian activism for Asian Americans, for interracial solidarity. She spoke out against anti-Muslim bias after the World Trade Center attacks in 2001. You know, this was a woman who understood the importance of developing community, kinship, and solidarity in service of liberation of all people. You know, she believed that after 2001, she said, we Japanese Americans should feel a kinship with the Arab and Muslim Americans who are the newest targets of racism, hysteria, and jingoism. So she, you know, was able to build on her personal experience, the reading that she did, the grassroots organizing that she participated in across racial and across causes in order to build what I think Diane Fujino, or her biographer, is called, you know, a radical solidarity.
Thank you, Professor Burrell. I'd like to continue this same conversation by asking Professor Victor Torres Velez what some of the challenges are of building alliances between AAPI and Latinx and Latin American and Caribbean people, specifically because here at Hostos, 62% of our students self-identify as Hispanic. Professor?
Yes, hi, it's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm honored to be among such accomplished scholars and people that have been selected in public office. I want to I'm an anthropologist, so we're always sort of looking at sort of historical, not just historical, but discursive trends. And I think that's something important to keep in mind is the relationship between empire building, colonialism, that is the specific relationship that some countries have in relation to less powerful countries during any specific historical moment, right? I mean, we can think about the age of imperialism, which lasted from 1874 to 1945. And of course, it was not limited to empire building of European nations. We're also including here a United States as an empire. And so it is very telling that the relationship of these empires had with the colonizing spaces was one of course, subordination, exploitation, racism, and so on and so forth. So there is that history in there. And of course, there is the history when you look at the United States as a nation and how it was formed, that there is perhaps an even longer link to discourses that have been present for the longest, right? If we think that, if we trace back the fact that slaveholding system in the United States can be pinpointed to 1619, right? If we look back at the U.S. Constitution and we saw in that Constitution that the Declaration of Human Rights as was limited to white folks who own property. If we look at the U.S. Civil War, 1865, and then the Jim Crow era, I mean, what we're talking about in here is a very profound history of racism that is built in within the very makeup of this nation. And so once you take that sort of larger look, I mean, it becomes evident that, institutional, there is a reason why there is institutional racism the way it is experienced by many in the States. So there is that part, right? That part of a long history with a specific way with dealing with the so-called minority problem within the nation state, in this case, United States. And then there's the other history of those folks that experience that type of oppression. So, I myself, I'm Puerto Rican. Puerto Rico is one of the oldest colonies in the world, but not unlike, Philippines, Hawaiians, and Pacific islands that suffer also under colonialism. We experience, we share that experience, the history, the brutal history of colonialism, and so in fact, our very presence here in the States stem from that specific history of oppression. And so in that sense, we have that shared history. The current wave of xenophobia, violence, painfully remind us how fragile the promises of the American dream are for us, and I'm including here all of us, right? All of us that are looked as minorities, right? The minority other. For us, this fragility, the fragility of this project and the violence that threatens it, is neither new nor surprising, as some of you, pointed out, rightly so. It's not new, it's not surprising. Unfortunately, it's something that is experienced by many, Latinos and Asian Americans, and of course, African Americans. And so when we talk about building solidarities, what are some of the challenges? Well, some of the challenges have to do precisely with how entrenched and how emboldened has been the sort of hate discourses that have emerged with the last administration, that have given that sort of woken up the dormant giant of on the one hand poor whites, on the other hand it has also emboldened rather regressive, conservative discourses that it has made now possible for people to openly be racist and be okay about it, right? In positions of important positions of power, like in Congress. I mean, just every day I open the newspaper on my computer, right, and I read some of the comments that are done by elected officials in Congress. It just blows away my mind, the level of just, I mean, completely, you know, I can't even pinpoint, you know, the, you know, white supremacy and hate speech, the level of openness. I mean, now I totally miss the political correct, you know, era where they will hush hush, you know, say things behind your back. Now they say it in your face, and on the one hand that's great, on the other hand it's not so much, right? And so I think that one of the challenges that we have to confront is the fact that now the level of discourse have come to a low that I cannot even fathom, you know, how can we get out of that? But, you know, we have to. And second, and so, as some of you were mentioning, there is also the fact that even though we share a history of oppression, and when I say we again, you know, those that are identified as minority others in here, unfortunately, we not always look eye to eye, right? Unfortunately, there is a lot of within the group rivalries and between the group rivalries as well. So this is something that we have to work to build the bridges. And one last thing I want to say about this is that, you know, just yesterday I was reading this newspaper article, and you know, over 12 states are ready to pass laws prohibiting the teaching of critical race theories in, you know, K to 12. This is a concerted effort to undermine any capacity to critically look at the history of our folks in here in the United States, and to be able to teach our students to, you know, develop critical thinking and develop the tools to build these bridges that are so important, perhaps more important now than ever, given the current conditions under which we are living. I'm going to leave it there because otherwise I will keep talking. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor. And as you mentioned, there's been a long ingrained belief and behaviors in terms of hate and violence that many have been experiencing. And we'd now like to ask Ms. Saadia Zaman if she can tell us a little bit about her experience with microaggressions as a South Asian woman.
Of course. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Professor Yolongo, for telling me about this. So there are like many stereotypes that still exist today around South Asians, such as, you know, like, for example, like the food we eat, jobs we work, how we are expected to look in terms of height, weight, skin color, clothing, and like, you know, like our behavior, or like our accents, like as well as our smell. So, you know, like people have told me before that like, oh, I bet you eat curry every day, which of course we don't, you know, like we're still from here. Or things like, oh, like, is your dad a taxi driver? You know, like once this elderly white man came up to me and said, I'm surprised you're in college and trying to become a doctor because I heard that many Bangladeshis are just taxi drivers or like restaurant employees and they're not doing so well. You know, like that's when I told him that like, well, like many of us are doing well, especially like now us children are accomplishing great things, you know? So like, it's like our intellectual development is not considered as high as others. You know, like people often think about, you know, just like think that like being from India and Bangladesh is exact same thing. But even when I explain to them how these are like completely just like two different countries, they still insist on believing that it's the same thing when it's not, you know? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Zaman. At this time, we do need to bid farewell to our senator. Senator Liu, thank you so much for joining us. We're very grateful for your time and for your words.
Thank you for having me. I apologize. I have to get off by 1 o'clock, but I'm going to stay on till 12:59 and 59 seconds.
We're grateful. Thank you. And so Ms. Zaman had just talked a little bit about you know, her experiences as a student. So now we'd like to pivot to this second round of questions for all of you panelists to talk to us a little bit about what we can do as communities to work together and to support each other. So Congresswoman, I'd like to come back to you and ask you, what are the political implications of this anti-AAPI sentiment and violence? And why has this galvanized Asians and Asian Americans across all generations?
Well, I will say that as an Asian American who grew up here in New York, I've never seen such a widespread showing of support from so many within and beyond the Asian American community. I work in Congress where, Congress passed the law that Professor Moy talked about, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And just in this year, we have seen our new president, President Biden, nominate the first Native American secretary at the Interior Department, welcome Asian Americans and dreamers and the daughter of George Floyd to the White House. And so I will say that I really believe that we are at a galvanizing moment for the Asian American community, but so many other communities as well. And I so appreciate everything that's been said during this discussion. And I wish everyone, the whole world, well, we are being recorded, so hopefully people will hear what our professors and our students have been saying today, because I think that that solidarity is something that is part of all of us making history together, participating in marches for Black Lives Matter, marching against anti-Semitism, marching to stop the Muslim ban. These have all been diverse movements. And for many communities, especially maybe the older or the newer immigrants, might have been the first experience or first conversations that they've had about diverse community members coming together. And, just another note about the importance of teaching history. There was a recent survey done, I forgot who did it, but where 42% of Americans, of the respondents, couldn't even name a well-known Asian American. And the next largest group of respondents could only think of Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan. And so that really just emphasizes why we need more diverse curriculum, so that our students, our leaders, are learning a more complete teaching of what American history is.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I'd like to elaborate a little bit on your sentiments of recent experiences and attacks in New York City, particularly just myself last week. I witnessed, in Times Square, there were folks peacefully protesting the issue in Gaza, and there were people attacking them and, spitting on them and hitting them. And it was really just disturbing to view that you can't even peacefully protest in our own city. I hear you, and I appreciate you bringing that up for us. I'd like to now go to Executive Director Moy. Previously, Professor Pai noted how colleges can institutionally respond, and Senator Liu had mentioned how the community has responded for the areas he serves. What other suggestions do you have to address anti-Asian hate?
There are numerous things, but primarily it really begins with education. Education in terms of the courses and information that our students are exposed to from the day they walk through our doors. Opportunities for the different student communities to meet and get to know one another. Our student clubs are all wonderful, but they're terribly siloed. So that's something that we can address. The other thing is I wanted to go back and just comment on some of the things that my fellow panelists mentioned. One of the things about the Asian understanding of racism, one of the things you need to keep in mind is that 57% of the Asian American community in the United States is foreign born. Nearly a third of them have only been in the United States for 10 years. So they come from a country and a culture which is fairly uniform, and being dropped in this racialized society puts them in the position of taking actions that may be based on economic survival and other reasons that make it appear that they are anti-solidarity with other communities, when in fact, it is the fact that they're unfamiliar with this racialized society and the fact that we are being pitted against one another primarily on economic issues. There have been a number of instances historically where there has been solidarity between Black and Latino communities and the Asian communities. I grew up during the Civil Rights Movement. I'm that old. And I must tell you that the first time I ever saw a picture of Mao Zedong, because we never taught anything about China in the United States, was in the centerfold of the Black Panther paper. And I ran home and I asked my father, who is this man? And my father said to me, he is the leader of China. And that's without putting a political spin about whether you supported communist China or not, that sort of thing. And, you know, Martin Luther King was heavily influenced by the thinking and philosophy of Gandhi. Much of his peaceful protest approach was a result of what he had learned and discussions that he had had with Gandhi and so on. In terms of solidarity with the Latino community, there is the instance of the agricultural strikes and Cesar Chavez and the Mexican farm workers. That came about because the Filipino farm workers decided to strike. And then they approached Cesar Chavez, who then joined with them. And that was a life-changing event for those farm workers. So, and there was a common economic purpose in those situations. So one of the things we need to understand is what are our common interests and when are there opportunities for us to work together? And again, it is in that history. Walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Understand what it must be like to be the parent of a Black child, knowing that an encounter with law enforcement may mean that your child is in prison, his life ruined, or he's returned to you in a body bag. Know those kinds of things. Know what it must be like to be a mother of a baby and being attacked. What happens if you're incapacitated? What happens to that baby? So again, I can go on and on again, but what we must teach is the history so we understand each other's values, that we are all assets. This country was not built by a master race. This country was built by all of us. We connected this country coast to coast and made those opportunities available. And we as the assets and the value, we as the people that make America great have to be highlighted in our history.
Thank you. Yes, and I hope today's roundtable is a first step for all of us to begin that discourse and conversation about educating ourselves even. I myself just learned something new. I didn't know about Chavez and his allyship with the Filipino farmers. So thank you for teaching me something new. Professor Pai, I'd like to now ask you, earlier you had talked about equity, specifically that all students, staff, and faculty must be seen and heard for us to continue to build an inclusive community college campus. My next question to you is, how can colleges elevate student voices to be at the center of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how do we make it work?
Yeah, thanks, Diana. Yeah, so I'd say before we even talk about elevating students' voices, we have to first make sure that all the students, well, all the statements and messaging even reaches students in the first place, right? So I spoke earlier about making institutional statements, but I'd say that it's not enough to just make a statement that's emailed to the community and posted on the college website. So part of what I wrote about is also that we need to put in the extra effort to make those statements in channels and platforms that actually reach the students. So if we know from our communications office, for example, that Instagram is the most popular social media platform, then we need to make sure that we're posting not just on Twitter and also on Instagram. It seems like an inane kind of topic, but I think it's critical, right? And cross-posting messages on multiple platforms, it does take time and effort, but we need to make sure, we need then to support our social media and digital marketing teams to do that work. And I would say that this matters even more at colleges with proportionally fewer AAPI students, lest those students feel even more marginalized because they probably already feel marginalized in the first place. A second thing is that I feel like many of our DEI professional development initiatives in recent years on topics like implicit bias, culturally relevant pedagogy, or truth and racial healing circles, they don't actually include students, right? We spend a lot of time talking about students, but it astonishes me how little we actually involve students in these sessions where we can hear students tell their narratives or accounts firsthand. So here I want to pause to just applaud you all for having Sadia here in this program and Sadia for you being here. And one last thing is that what I like to see more of is also student designed and student led initiatives on DEI. So for example, at my college at Gutman, I am also the advisor of Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society, our chapter. And this year I've supported our students in creating an Amplifying Student Voices website, where they designed a website where all college students can submit stories, essays, poems, photography, artwork, music, right? Issues of diversity, social justice, and health and wellness. And then last week, the chapter also worked on hosting an Ending Single Stories event that's built off of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk. Right? So it was an event where students led the discussions on issues like police brutality and systemic racism. But there, I would also say that faculty and staff need to guide students towards critical consciousness. Right? So I myself have been fighting for social justice for 20 plus years, and I often forget that many students, especially the ones straight out of high school, are not actually aware of these issues and all the matters that all my fellow colleagues here brought up earlier. And because of that, they may not actually see past the societal status quo, much less how to challenge that. So we really need to also like put in the effort to make the space for them to be able to launch their own initiatives, but then also guide them so that there's an element of critical consciousness in that. And to that end, I just want to end by saying that I'm excited about what can come out of the CUNY's Black Race and Ethnic Studies Initiative. And hopefully out of that, we can make great and real strides in expanding ethnic studies offerings, decolonizing our curricula, and also teaching history like Director Moy just talked about, right? And there with the goal of increasing not only students' critical consciousness and socio-political awareness, but also their ability, again, to create and lead initiatives at the college of their design. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Professor. I think we can all agree and stand side by side with you in the sentiment of bringing students into the work and having them lead the way. I would love to see your website. If you could drop it for us in the chat, that would be great. I'd like to learn a little bit myself as well. Professor Burrell and I actually, as a brief aside, we do also oversee the new initiative at our college called Black at Hostos. And we were fortunate enough to be invited to speak at the Faculty Diversity and Inclusion Conference in April as well. So we are trying to really continue assessing what opportunities we need to offer for inclusion for our students and also how to bring their voices in. So thank you for suggesting some ideas. So Professor Chang, can you tell us a little bit about how voters and policymakers, how can voters and policymakers respond to the rise of crimes and racism? What is it that they can do?
Great. Sorry if there's a little bit of background street noise coming through the window here. I think, overall, to demand justice and change for Asian Americans necessitates that we, and I just don't mean Asian Americans, but royal we everyone, are part of the government system of justice and fight to be included. But not just that, to also challenge the status quo outside government and the typical channels with collective political action like protests that we've seen. And this can happen in multiple ways, and I'll highlight three. First, I've mentioned before, and other people have mentioned before, that visibility and representation matters. I think we need more Asian American candidates, appointed and elected officials at all levels of government. And while we need diverse candidates to seek office, but also from bottom to top, staffers, people who are involved, and there's a pipeline to leadership, whether it is elected or appointed. And this is why we saw Senator Duckworth's demand for more representation from the Biden administration. But also it's not just Asian Americans, but also people of color candidates, LGBTQIA candidates and officials, and Gen Z, younger candidates and officials and more. And second, we need our elected officials to pass laws that address anti-Asian violence and hate, but also across the board, strengthening protections for national origin discrimination, which is in the Constitution. I think we've already talked a little bit about the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act that was sponsored by Representative Meng and signed by President Biden just last week. It's an example of what can happen at the federal level. And this legislation is, primarily data collection and encouraging people to report hate crimes and, works with the Department of Justice. So it's just a start. And along with that, laws and policies that support education on Asian American history and important Asian American figures. I think Representative Meng mentioned that, very disheartening statistic. It's one statistic that, 42% of Americans, a survey of 3,000 Americans couldn't name a prominent Asian American person. And I think that is disheartening, to say the least. And finally, voters we all need to embrace politics in some way, even though we may not like it or think it works all the time or much of the time. And at the most basic level, we can, well, especially Asian Americans, but anyone can have issue-based discussions with older and younger people and their families and their friend groups and across generations. What has happened in the last year has shined a light on what is going on, but it's just an opening. I myself have tried to do this with my family. It was quite politically averse. My parents, they always say to me all the time, we moved to the United States because we wanted to get away from politics, and we don't really discuss it, and I forced them to vote. But, Asian American voters can also organize themselves and ally with other groups. I think that's, where we get the AAPI label itself. And so we really need to harness that increasing voting power and growing Asian American population going forward. And locally in New York City, the past few ranked choice voting races so far this year have shown that mobilizing specific voting groups can really make a difference. Those dozens, hundreds of voters, votes cast really have a deciding factor. And I could go on and on about voting in elections, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Professor Chang. And we do enjoy your frequent events of the political ilk, particularly your most recent one on ranked choice voting. So duly noted, and thank you for that. Professor Burrell, Professor Chang has just mentioned what policymakers can do. Can you give us some context to how policymakers have approached immigration historically, both in its exclusive phases and more broadly inclusive phases?
Yeah, sure. So it is really, one of the shames of U.S. history that, our first immigration law was the law that Director Moy, shared, the 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act. But that act came as a result of, pressure, from native-born, white Americans, primarily on the West Coast, who were, actively, working in order to exclude, Chinese immigrants, from American society. And, you had organizations such as the Working Man's Party in California that had this, anti-Chinese platform. Groups such as the, quote, the Order of Caucasians for the Extermination of the Chinamen, right, formed in the 1870s, that were, trying to eliminate, Chinese people from the United States. And so, although, Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans were literally constructing the country, literally connecting the nation, building intercontinental railroads, establishing businesses. The irony, one of the, real paradoxes was that on the one hand, Chinese people in the United States were, said that they were, not real Americans or shouldn't be part of American society because they were so different and they kept to themselves. And yet Chinese people were not allowed to become citizens of the United States. They were not allowed to become naturalized citizens. So how can you become, be part of a country, right, that you're not allowed, legally to be part of? And, we also see this happen, with other groups as well. This segregation that has been endemic throughout US history has been the result of law and policy that has, not allowed for different groups to fully experience and take advantage of the rights and privileges that are supposed to come with American citizenship. Of course, during World War II, there was the Executive Order 9066 that allowed for Japanese Americans to be interned during the war. although no other groups that the United States was at war with during this period were interned, right? And even people like Dr. Seuss, right, were drawing political cartoons that portrayed Japanese Americans in a stereotypical and negative light, being referred to as the quote unquote fifth column, right? The enemy within. Somehow their loyalty could not be to the United States, but rather had to be to Japan, right? And so, our government has dealt with immigration with regard to Asian nations in very exclusive ways, right? Things didn't begin to change until after the 1965 Immigration Act, which then began to, broaden the numbers of people and the places where people could immigrate to the United States from. But of course, that law, has its limitations as well, right? And immigration continues to be a significant problem, right, in terms of how we as a nation deal with and accept immigrants into our society. We have this myth that, we are the country that accepts your poor, your titled, your huddled masses. And yet oftentimes the experience of people who immigrate to the United States is much more complex and often very hostile. And so, we have to come to grips with that history of racism, of discrimination as a result of our white supremacist fabric, if we're going to do anything constructive and positive to get beyond it.
Thank you, Professor Burrell. And I hear you when you say that it feels in some ways, based on your remarks, that we continue to relive history every few years or decades rather. And with all of these recurring issues and violent acts. So with that, I'd like to ask Professor Torres Velez, we've already spoken about political potential alliances between communities of color, specifically Asians, Blacks, and Latinos. What could make such alliances potentially powerful?
We, as I mentioned before, even though we have this shared history of oppression that potentially might seem will make us instant allies, I think the assumption that it will make us instant allies is problematic, and that's hard to wrap your head around, because often we might be operating under that assumption. I think that if we are to be successful to supersede the current discourses, hate discourses, and thus build a more equitable type of society where minorities can thrive and not feel threatened, we have to understand that solidarities need to be built, right? And the way in which we build those types of solidarities is, of course, by understanding our history on the one hand. I think that the role of professors and classrooms, and I, of course, being one, I'm particularly keen in that idea that the classrooms become a space where we can expose our students, we can provide them with some tools for them to develop their own critical learning skills, their critical racist theory frameworks to better wrestle with the world that is out there. And so in addition to that, of course, in addition to use the classroom as a place where meaningful discussions happen in a safe environment, where they can express their ideas, where they can develop these ideas. There are concrete type of spaces that the university also offers, right? Like student clubs, for instance. I've been advising the Dream Team Student Club at Hostos for the last 3 years or so. And during, of course, during the previous administration, which was, you know, a rather scary moment for immigrant students. And what was fascinating about that experience on my end was to see students empowering themselves to confront, you know, what was a super scary moment in our history. And that's powerful. From there, many of the students that you know participated in this group have moved on into other institutions and they're carrying now the torch, right, of fighting inequalities. And so that those kinds of very concrete, you know, practices of, you know, of resistance, I think, you know, are powerful and will allow perhaps for us to overcome these rather difficult moment. As I was sort of also thinking about, you know, all of these, you know, sort of oppression that is going on right now, that is not surprising, as some of you mentioned before. There's something that we cannot forget, and it is that our communities are still here, right? They are standing strong, proud, and there is so much more for us to learn from each other, right? To move forward. And I'm, you know, in that sense, I'm very hopeful. So yeah, that's the power of alliance if we work to build it. That's all I want to say. Thank you so much for the opportunity and the amazing folks that are here today. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Sadia, I'd like to ask you the last question. So Professor Torres Velas had just spoken a little bit about the potential for alliances. And one of the potential ways forward is to challenge assumptions that exist in our society. The way South Asians are portrayed in the media, for example, experiencing typecasting, we'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about what has been referred to as light skin privilege, also known as colorism, when it comes to representation of acceptable standards of beauty.
Yeah, of course. So there are still issues of colorism in South Asian society, you know, such as beauty standards by shade of skin color. The media continues to misrepresent, you know, South Asians by revealing actors as having thick accents, making us look submissive and prone to mistreatment and crime. And so like in American media, South Asians are represented primarily by Indians. Also, the South Asians that appear on these media forums tend to be like dark skinned with like thick accents and often play a character that is like seen as a joke. So like these characters are often like shown as like 7-Eleven, like or like deli employees, cab drivers, and like other stereotypical roles. So like South Asian female characters are also thought to be like stereotyped as submissive, and the you know like the hijab is like often like not shown in a respectful way. So like in the media, we are not able to like voice our opinions, such as considering our holidays or just like having Eid as like an official holiday in which all schools are closed. Also, like there has been a noticeable lack of people of color in the government and top positions in companies. You know, like also like, you know, it's like sometimes like people like tell me things like, you're too pretty and tall to be Bengali. You know, like most Bengalis are short or like dark skinned. So like once I participated in a local South Asian fashion show, and only the lighter skinned South Asians got chosen. Also, like the posters and commercials for any similar, you know, just like events and products feature primarily just like lighter skinned people. So it's very necessary to look at every person equally and like not discriminate by looking at their color of skin. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Aman, and well said. It's important that we all look past these societal structures that can be very misleading for all. I'd now like to welcome the entire audience to participate in some Q&A directly from you. So if you'd like to submit your questions at this time, I will take them. I'd like to go back and ask our panel, let me open you all so that everyone can see you, and ask you all. So Dean Garcia Reyes is joining us. Good afternoon, Dean. And she posed a question for the senator before he left, but I'd like to open it to the panel now. And she says, what message do you have for students who are facing insensitive anti-Asian attacks?
I would say that one of the things we must understand is that you are not the problem. Other people are the problem. I have a 7-year-old grandson who asked whether we had to change the way we look. And I had to explain to him, no, you are not the problem. It is the other people who are the problem. The key, however, is that we have to understand that people are dealing realistically with emotions and with fear, and that fear is real, it's rational. We have to be supportive and acknowledge that and validate their feelings. And then we need to check in on one another to see how we're doing, how we can be supportive, whether it's just sitting down and talking with someone or walking with them, or perhaps just checking in to make sure they got to their destination. But it's important to do everything that we can to be supportive of these individuals, give them a place and to speak, a safe space to speak, and to help them understand that their fears are valid and real. It's nothing to be ashamed of. There's nothing for you to hide.
I would just agree that it is always important to acknowledge a person's humanity, right? First and foremost, and and to share that, like Director Moy said, the other person, the person who's engaging in this, sort of racist act or insensitive act, is the one who has the issues to deal with, not the person who is on the receiving end of that mistreatment, and that they should take advantage of whatever structures are available at their institution in order to get the assistance that they need, if at all possible, in order to deal with those types of situations.
Sure. I mean, I would add on to what both what has been said before. I think also to, if it's available, to be able to speak and report and create that visibility, to make it real that these things are not isolated, and it's a real thing happening to real people. And going along with what Professor Pye mentioned earlier is that I think not just Asian Americans, but I think students, faculty, staff, all of us, bystander training. I think that is to have that in the back pocket is important, and something that we could all prepare ourselves. I mean, it's unfortunate that we have to do that, but I mean, it is the reality, and I would encourage anyone to look at those principles and those steps up.
I mean, I guess I could add to what Professor Chang just said, that's indeed what I was going to reiterate too, the importance of bystander training, right? Because it's also, right, it teaches people how to react to the person who is actually being the target. So it's part, like, I mean, there's many organizations that now offer it. So I would love to see institutional support for that, right? Where colleges offer that to faculty, staff, and students, but individuals too. Like I myself just also registered through organizations like organizations into the chat box if people would like.
Sorry, Professor, I think your audio cut off briefly. Can you name those organizations once more for us?
Oh, one is Holla Back. I'll put it in the chat box. But also local city council members, like my city council member Corey Johnson, he offered a bystander training too. So there's definitely many avenues to look into for that.
Thank you. And if I may, I'd like to add, specifically because in my research to prepare for this event, I noted how many, right, there's a myriad of resources online, right? And so I feel like the younger generation really has so many opportunities that may not be as prevalent to the elderly, particularly folks from the Asian community who may not know how to respond when they experience a hate crime or when they observe one in their sight, or their family may have brought it home and said, this is what I experienced today. And I found this incredibly helpful tool. I'll post it in the chat now so that everyone could take a look and review it at their leisure. But it's called the Hate Crime Book. And it is this woman who, she had an issue with her own family in translating resources to be made available for her local community in her church. And it's offered, I believe, in 8 or 9 languages, and all different Asian languages. They have Vietnamese, Thai, Japanese, Chinese, traditional and simplified. And so what they really try to outline clearly and easily is what to do, what steps to take when you experience or would like to report a hate crime. So I thought I'd just put that in the chat for you all, and then allow everyone at this time, all the panelists, to offer their closing statements, as I do not see any more questions. So I would like to begin in the order that we took questions. If you would please, Executive Director Moy, is there anything you'd like to say before we close?
Yes, I really would like to challenge all of us to take this horrible period that we've gone through in witnessing the disparities due to COVID, in witnessing the death of George Floyd, and hearing about and witnessing the deaths of others in ways that have been unjust for centuries, and take our own human experiences and again, reach out to others, step up, speak up, join with others to speak up. And let's try to change the dynamics. We can't go back to the world we had. We can't go back to the world or live in the world that we have seen unfold before us in the past year. We've got to change things. We've got to move forward and have a different world.
Thank you, and well said. Professor Pai.
Yeah, I want to first just thank all my fellow panelists again. I really did learn so much from you today. And also I want to thank you, Diana and Ernest, and give Hostos a big kudos for putting this program together. So I was checking out the whole program, the agenda. So from reflecting on growth mindset to learning about COIL and orienting faculty on cognito, I was just really struck by how forward-looking the agenda is. So it's clear that you guys are really preparing yourselves for how to support students for the new normal. So I just want to take a minute to applaud you for that. And I think the word that really stands out to me now after hearing all my fellow panelists today is the word history, right? So what I think I'm taking away is just that we need to really continue the momentum that we've built this year, we as an AAPI community, I mean, by expanding our teaching of the important history that so many of my colleagues referenced today. Rather than just living history, right? We need to really make history, like Congresswoman Meng said before she left, and continue things like organized political and social action. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. And more importantly, thank you for sharing that article. It really struck us, both myself and Cherry Alongo, when we got to read it, that this was really a needed conversation at our college. So thank you for bringing light to this conversation. Professor Chang, any closing remarks?
Sure. I think that, as this event has highlighted, this violence and hate against Asian Americans, has resonated across generations of Asian Americans, and kind of, opened people's eyes and given more visibility. And I think as we imagine, this post-COVID future where, really it is a very, who knows, right? And there are little steps that we can take and bigger steps that we can take. Smaller is having those discussions, being available to talk about our experiences. And bigger is, going out there, voting, educating yourself. So I think there is a lot of opportunity, as people have mentioned, and it's really up to us individually and collectively to take advantage of that.
Good point. Thank you, Professor Chang. Professor Burrell.
Thank you. I will bring this back to Yuri Kochiyama and just try to summarize a couple of lessons that we might be able to take from her life in this moment. The first, and this comes from her biographer, Diane Fujino. The first one is this need for solidarity, right? That we can not only look to the interests of our own people. First of all, who are our own people? Many of us cross multiple groups, and at the same time, working out of self-interest gets us in a trap. It's like the model minority myth, where Asian Americans work out of self-interest, but the gains that one group makes comes at the expense of other groups. This is not a model of liberation. It's a very problematic model, and one that Yuri Kochiyama always resisted. She always said and operated by the ethos that, quote, my people's liberation is intricately tied to your people's liberation. I cannot be free if you're not free. We need to think about how things that impact the most vulnerable among us work out of those best interests. The second thing is that we cannot just work in reactionary ways every time there's an incident. a new incident of an attack on Asian Americans, yet another killing of an unarmed Black person, or attacks against indigenous peoples and their lands and waters. It gets us nowhere. It's a constant battle and it's exhausting. And what's most important is that we build movements for liberation. We are in need of the kinds of radical solidarity that Yuri Kochiyama's life exemplified.
That was beautiful, Professor. Thank you for sharing those words. I think they resonated with most of us as we were listening. And Professor Torres Velez, if you would.
Right, yeah, I just want to say thank you to all of you. I think that spaces like this one that has been created by the organizers of the event are precisely the kinds of things that we need to build these radical solidarity movements and to be able to move forward the struggle. And so I'm so honored to be part of this, and I'm so looking forward to hear more from you and to hear from more references, perhaps. I'm constantly revising my syllabus, so I welcome recommendations and collaborations as well. So please, let's get this as a starting point of something perhaps much larger and powerful. Thank you.
We are in complete agreement. Thank you, Professor. There's only more to come at Hostos. And speaking of the future of Hostos, I welcome Ms. Aman to share some of her remarks.
Thank you, everyone. I learned a lot today. It's important that we don't just judge others. It's necessary to be aware of things and educate ourselves as much as possible before speaking or acting ill towards people. Everyone's not the same. We need to stick together in these difficult times and not judge. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear your words and take them to heart. So I'd like to offer just a few of mine before I offer it to my co-partner here, Chair Ilongo. I'd like everyone to just know, for the faculty, staff, and the students joining us in the audience and our guests, take this information back to your places of work. Take it back to your homes, take it back to your friends, your family. Spread the word. There are events all over. There's information everywhere now, and it's important that we be educated, and it's important that we read to learn, and we learn to share. So please make sure you do your part, play your roles, speak to your students, faculty, students, speak with your peers, bring up those tough conversations with each other when you witness something happening. And staff, please make sure you build the allyship and build partners across campus for events that may be needed or conversations that need to be had, not just at the water cooler, but for college-wide purposes. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my co-chair, Professor Ilongo.
Thank you, Diana. This has been really a wonderful, wonderful event. When the president suggested that we do this, neither Diana nor I knew exactly how this was going to look, but we knew it had to happen, and we knew the people that we wanted as a part of this panel. So I wanted to first of all thank all the members of the panel for being here. You've been incredible, exactly what we wanted. A blend of history and politics, contemporary events, the history of the nation, context. And it's done the two things that I think we wanted to do here today, building on the idea of humanizing victims of violence, so that you have to call it for what it is to begin the process of stopping it. And secondly, building the solidarity, bringing those lines across all peoples. And I'm really, really proud of everything that we did here today. And I want to thank CTL, Mr. Guevara and Professor Jones for letting us be the final event of Spa Day. They were incredibly generous with their time. And I also want to give a shout out to the honors program that Cynthia Jones and I co-direct, and Sadia Zaman is a member of that program, a shining member of that program. And you did great today, Sadia. But lastly, I also want to say that Diana, Ms. Kramer, you are extraordinary. I couldn't imagine this happening in any better with anyone else. Just extraordinary work on your part. Thank you for partnering in this with me on behalf of the Senate to making this for the college. And I look forward to future opportunities to do good work together.
Thank you so much. And I agree. I think when we first embarked on this journey, we weren't really sure how to begin really fleshing out the program. And just by the many faces joining us here on the Zoom call, it's really a testament to our networks and also to the CUNY family. So we're very grateful to all of you and for your commitment to taking the time today to speak with all of us. And President, thank you for rejoining us. Would you like to offer some words?
I wanted to just say that I so appreciate this, and I do hope that this is not a one-time occurrence, that this becomes part of the same way when we had the town hall about Black Lives Matter, that it then became Black at Hostos, still, that there will be follow-up every semester of conversations around that. As a young dean, I was at your college when our president asked me to help bring about some activities to support cultural diversity. And one of those was a nation project. I went to the East-West Center and the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. I spent 2 summers, 1 month each, getting ready to integrate. And this was a predominantly African-American school with a few Latinos. And so we created at that time an Asian reading room with support from the Japan Society and others. I don't know whether that, because I left Hostos in 2000, and I left York in 2002 to come to Hostos to be the provost. So part of what we did as a project of diversity was to actually publish some of the proceedings. So there was a conference we had. And I'm saying this as a way to introducing just a couple of closing lines in this book that was put together, Asian Culture, Tradition, and Diaspora, and that I edited at the time. And so I was really, really impressed with the work of Shuntaro, a Japanese poet. He would be older than I, so he's still, I checked to make sure he was still there. There it is, Diana has it, because I shared some of those, the copies I had left. And I just wanted to say, so I just want to read briefly a couple of lines from one of his poems called Shadows of Trees, that ends, yes, there is joy in this day, as in the heart of the young sun. There is joy because there was a sincere effort to come together as the world family to talk about how to support one another in this world that has gone increasingly hateful. I mean, over the years, but this is just this week, listening to the news, all the anti-Semitic attacks that are happening as well. And it gets so absolutely sad, but it is about hope. It is about hope. And it is about understanding that to know one another is to understand one another and to respect one another, because we have so much more in common as part of the world family. And there's the diversity is, we celebrate. I celebrate the poetry all the time from multiple countries, because this poetry is about that, connecting the heart and the mind and saying all these things are real for all of us, believing in hope and love and working together. So I apologize. I ran right back as soon as that other meeting was over, and I'm very sorry, but I understand it was taped, so I am going to enjoy it. Diana will make sure she puts it in, makes it available to me so that I hear all of you, my dear colleagues and friends. And thank you especially to Diana and to Professor Yalongo and to Eric Radesky and others who worked to bring us all together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, President. We have now reached the end of our event. Once more, we thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and we thank our Spa Day organizers for offering us this space. And we would be remiss on behalf of Provost Yolongo, Chair Yolongo and myself, if we did not also acknowledge our colleagues in the President's Office, Dr. Eric Radesky and Executive Counsel Eugene Son, who helped put this event together and help bring in all of our political and academic panelists. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.